Thank you, Acting President. I rise to make a contribution to Mr Davis's motion calling for a select committee to look into Victoria's planning provisions, which Legalise Cannabis Victoria will be supporting. I want to be very clear at the outset, housing matters. Housing should be available, should be affordable, and it should enjoy appropriate infrastructure to ensure a decent quality of life for all Victorians. We need appropriate, affordable and accessible housing in Victoria, and that doesn't exist now in adequate quantity. Everyone, I think, in this chamber would agree with this simple proposition. The question dividing this chamber is how to best achieve that goal. Now, this motion before the chamber is not about whether you agree or disagree with the government's proposals on where new homes should be built or how quickly. I really implore my colleagues from the government side not to simply caricature this as NIMBYism. It's not. In terms of this proposition, it's not about whether you agree with the government's proposals on where and how to build. It's because I would say at the outset that the overarching settlement strategy in the plan for Victoria is pretty sound. Yeah? It's a pretty good document. So this is about whether the new planning controls that the government has been introducing one at a time by regulation are appropriate and give effect to the objectives of planning and the planning framework as described in the Planning and Environment Act 1987. So are these regulations consistent with the Act under which they're auspiced as subordinate legislation? How can you argue against that proposition? You know, do they comply with the Act or not? Are they consistent with the principles there? Now, I think we would all want to be confident that the government is fulfilling the requirements of that Act rather than frustrating it when it comes to new subordinate legislation. Now, other speakers have talked about the three different planning provisions, and so I won't go into that other than to note that if we actually start to delve into a few of those, we come to some interesting issues, some problematic issues that we would suggest warrant consideration. So if we just breeze through some of this, the first thing that caught my eye is that via VC 257, there will be a new housing choice and transport zone around activity centres and a new precinct zone for suburban rail loop precincts, which are also activity centres, but that the existing activity centre zones will not be used for any of the new activity centres. Okay, I just need to sort of percolate that one for a little while. So now there are 3 zones for activity centres instead of 1, and there are a few other special purpose zones that have been applied to activity centres in the past, still kicking around in the system as well. So we hear a lot from the government about reducing complexity in the planning system, yet at the same time having 3 to 5 different types of activity centre seems to be a pretty funny way to go about it. Now, the second point of interest perhaps is that all of the exemptions that are contained in the new deemed to comply provisions for 2 or more dwellings on a lot in a residential zone, known as the Townhouse and Low-Rise Code, which is part of VC 267. Now, I understand the government's objective in removing those barriers in the planning system that prevent the speedy approval of new homes. It's an important objective. Yeah, it's an important objective. But I'm not sure that that objective has been appropriately balanced with other objectives like protecting life and responding to local environmental risks. Okay? So let's take a look at a few examples of that deemed to comply provision. Okay? The new provision switches off, literally switches off local policies and applies a 10% tree canopy cover standard. Ms Mansfield referred to this before. This standard is lower than many councils are encouraging through their local policy. So will that help or hinder the government's plan for Victoria target for 30% cover across the state? It would be good to see some modelling, but are we talking about 10%? Are we talking about 30%? Clearly the two aren't the same, and they're not readily reconcilable. This is exactly the sort of thing that an inquiry can and should be looking at. The same provisions also switch off environmentally sustainable design policies for energy, waste and water. Again, think about that. They apply some standards, but where those standards are lower than those found in local policies, will that not reduce the quality of homes? Won't lower standards of energy efficiency make homes more expensive to run and to own? They also switch off the EPA Environment Reference Standards too. So does this mean that planners will be prevented from helping developers to improve their proposals and reduce air, sound and water conflicts? And well, yes, the answer is yes. It will have that effect. And it's a terrible result. They also switch off requirements to consider planning scheme amendments that have been adopted by council but not yet approved by the minister. This is very troubling. Let's say a council has adopted an amendment that changes the flood overlays, requiring a higher ground floor level for a new building, but the minister hasn't approved it yet. What then? And Mr Batchelor and I sat on this committee, talking on the Environment Planning Committee, talking about exactly this issue of how we respond in a timely manner with floodplains. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about that. Now, if we take this logic that is built into the code, does that mean that the applicant will fail to get a building permit and have to go to all the expense and effort of reapplying for one, because that's expensive and inefficient? Alternatively, will they get a building permit and go ahead and build something that the government's own flood modelling says is a risk to human habitats? You know, I mean, make up your mind. Given the need for timely advice to families who may be in the process of building their homes in an area potentially subject to inundation, it's utterly staggering that planners would be precluded, legislatively precluded, from the requirements to implement common sense resilience measures. And some might say, oh, what's the gap? It's not going to be much. Well, you know, talking about personal experience, in my community, we spent almost 2 years negotiating with council and developers a structure plan. And that structure plan, when approved by council, sat on the Minister for Planning's desk for 3 years before it got permission to advertise. 3 years. So we're not talking about fantasies here, you know. By all means, let's talk about real shit. And this is what's happening out there. Now, the example I've just cited about flood and floor levels could easily be the sort of time gap we're talking about, and I believe it's something this inquiry should be talking about as well.
Ms Terpstra, point of order. Yep.
Thank you, Acting President. I think Mr Ettershank just used some unparliamentary language, and I ask that he withdraw that unparliamentary language and honour the... Do you want me to repeat it?
No, I'm perfectly happy if I withdraw the comment. Thank you. It is these incongruities that need to be teased out and explored by a select committee. I am reliably informed that the consultation on the 3 amendments we are discussing today was overwhelmingly poor, notwithstanding some very high-level discussions about principles. But the actual detail, especially all the exemptions from normal planning considerations that the townhouse and low-rise code makes, was not even known until the amendment was gazetted. So the consequences of all these new provisions haven't been tested, not with councils, not with planners, not with developers, and not with the public. So we should not be sitting here being lectured to about NIMBYism and extended consultation processes when the government has not done that, and it has used regulation specifically to obviate its obligations in that regard. To pick up Mr Batchelor's comment about Environment and Planning Committee, yeah, we could do this review in 12 months, 14 months' time, yeah, where there's going to be a gap. Well, some of us don't want to wait till the dying days of this government to run into it. In terms of precluding community consultation, I mean, let's get real, yeah? I mean, this is the pot calling the kettle chartreuse. Let's get to the truth of these issues. This is a technical exercise. It is not a polemical exercise. Let's do a technical exercise on do these planning scheme amendments, are they consistent with the Act? Seriously, argue against that, please. You know, this is just common sense. I know people will come with their own agendas. They always have, they always will. But it doesn't mean this should be opposed, because we're trying to get to the truth and the appropriateness of this matter. Accordingly, we are happy to support the motion.